All right, welcome to chapter 6. We're looking at conformity and obedience. So, what we will be going over in this chapter, what is conformity, and looking at the classic conformity and obedience studies. So, conformity sometimes gets a bad reputation, but it could also have some positive aspects as well. In a nutshell, conformity encompasses any change in behavior or your beliefs based on pressure. And this pressure could be real pressure or it could be imagined. There are 3 types of conformity. Personally, acceptance is the best of the 3 types. And I put best in air quotes because your behavior is aligned with your beliefs with acceptance. On the other hand, to comply means that you are acting according to what others expect or ask of you, acquiescing, if you will, even though you may not personally agree. And then finally, obedience, which we're very familiar with, is about being responsive to a direct command or order. So you wouldn't have necessarily done this otherwise, but somebody was telling you to, and this person in most instances, some authority figure, so you are responding accordingly. So when we look at conformity, the broad, big bubble, then we have acceptance versus the other 2, where compliance and obedience, you respond and act similar to acceptance, but only because it is expected or you are commanded to. So to study conformity and obedience, we have to create mini social worlds to more deeply understand how and whys of conformity. There are 3 classic studies upon which most of what we have come to know about conformity are based upon. These are Sharif's studies of norm formation, Ash's study of group pressure, and by far most exciting, some would say the best, Milgram's obedience studies. So fun experiment number 1. You are in a darkened room, first alone, and you are shown a light that moves with the instructions to guess how far it has actually moved. You have a couple of trials of this alone, and then you come back another day, and then you come back another day, and then a couple of days after that. And each time you are asked again to look at this light and give, how far it has moved. In reality, the light actually isn't moving. But each of the subsequent days when you come, there are others who join you. And before you actually get to say how far you think it has moved, the other people before you speak. What do? Do you change your original answer so that it sounds similar to what others are saying? Or do you stick with what you originally thought? Well, regardless of what you say, what Sharif found is that the responses changed. And in essence, a norm was formed based on the individuals in there. So people started to respond so that their answer was closer to the answer before. So by the time as it got to the last person, everybody hovered around the same number. So they converged all to a point. Figure 2 in your chapter graphically shows this. People adjusted their responses to align with the guesstimates of others. Others who they didn't realize were also a part of the experiment. So we would call them confederates. These people were actually told what to say and when to say it to see if they would be able to influence the participant. And then in the example that I put you in it, you would be the participant. And the confederates would be those who went before you. And we go on a limb and think that you would probably respond very similar to those who were in Sharif's original study, and that you would be influenced by their responses. So, again, have you ever laughed because someone else did? Even though you may not have, actually gotten it, like, you didn't really find it funny, ha ha ha, but somebody else did. So this is what happens. Laughter can be contagious. And you know what? So is, excuse me, Did you yawn just now? Because so is yawning. Did you feel like yawning? Well, as we go on in this chapter, you would see, and it explains that so many of what we see are based on what we learned from. I want you to definitely read in your chapter about mass hysteria, because copycat crimes are not just made for TV. Whether we are aware or not, someone admitting to something primes us toward it, whether we then perceive to experience or to do as they did. So what we are learning here is that we are highly suggestible. And it's not in the instance of thinking that you are weak or you have a low self-esteem, because that's what people like to, make you feel. But it's just human beings. We want to be quote unquote normal. And so we take cues from others. And if somebody is doing something, we then, whether we are consciously aware of our kind of moving towards it, we decide to do it because we then think that is what you're supposed to do, because that's the norm, and no one really wants to be abnormal, right? So that was Sharif, and that was what we learned about norm formation. So when you go out there, you would have participated in the activity before this, where you would have gone and you would have broken a social norm. Those things are norms because they are what is accepted or acceptable in this culture. What you may have done, whatever your action was, whether it was that you sung loudly in an elevator, you turned the wrong way, you went and sat and joined somebody's conversation without asking, those things may not be that weird if you were to go someplace else. They may be normal there. Similarly, we go someplace and we say good morning to everybody we pass. We do that here in the Bahamas and it is quite fine. However, we do that elsewhere and it's not. All right, so that was Sharif's norm. We're on Ash, right? So screen that you're seeing is describing Ash's study of group pressure. And this is another fun experiment where we were comparing lines. This is a visual perception test. Again, Confederates, remember Confederates are those people who we actually pay or we say that we include them in. So whether we pay them or they just come and they're just doing it for free, they know that they are part of it. They're told what to do and what to say. So they were used in this and they were to intentionally give the wrong answer. More than 1/3 were willing to actually give the wrong answer to conform with the group. So this is similar to Sharif's experiments where the participants were responding given the responses of others. And here you see it. So the standard line and then the comparison lines. And so what they had to do is to say which one, number 1, number 2, or number 3 matches the line that you saw. Obviously, the answer is number 2, but if you were in a room with 5 other people, you were the only person saying number 2, everybody was saying number 1. Would you actually stick with your number 2 response, or would you say number 1? And again, mouth could say anything before you are in the situation, but being in is always a different experience. So other studies have followed up with this, and us understanding conformity and group pressure, for example. One of the studies reviewed in the text where 2 people were sitting at a table. One person is only really picking at their food, like they're not eating a lot, and then the other person ate less. The studies confirm that this susceptibility to social situations, and it is amazing how easily we would adjust our responses when there actually isn't. So somebody is eating slower or eat less, and so I kind of stop eating as quickly as well, and I follow their lead, if you will. So what will humans do when we are directly challenged to respond? So other studies have also looked at dental flossing, cancer screening. These are things that, people may or may not do, or they may respond a particular way when they are outside of a group. But then when it seems that everybody else is doing it, there's group pressure towards it, then people are more likely to oblige. And then Milgram. And let's set the context a little bit for this. Back in the 1960s, following the World War II trials, a researcher by the name of Stanley Milgram wanted to explore just how far we as humans would go when we are ordered to do something heinous. Like the others, Ash and Sharif, To create this research study and make sure it had experimental reality, he had to use both participants and Confederates. There were two groups of people. There was a teacher and then there was a learner. The design of the study was supposedly to measure memory and punishment, and basically how punishment impacts the learner. So a learner would be given word pairs to learn and would have to recall. The Confederates, remember that's the person who's being paid to be a part of the experiment, would always be the learner. And, right, I forgot to say it, they would also be strapped to a shock machine. The teacher was the true participant, the person who was clueless as to what was happening. And they were assigned to the teacher role, and they were instructed to deliver electric shock when the learner was wrong. So the learner, in quotes, so the pretend person, the person who's playing this role, intentionally answered incorrectly, meaning that the participant who was in the role of the teacher then had to press a button and that delivered electric shock. The learner would respond appropriately. If it was pretty intense, then he would scream, whatever. The teacher was directly admonished by a stern administrator. So this is the person who governed the study. So in that instance, it may be me, somebody who carries some kind of authority figure. And they were there to ensure that the study continued, so that the person who's playing the role of the teacher didn't cop out, and didn't punk out. And so what happened was the experimenter had preset responses. So the administrator would say, you have to continue, or please administer the shock, or the person got it wrong, or something like that. And I know you're sitting here and you're like, this is crazy. How would people participate in this? How did they even run this study? Well, we're happy. Well, not happy, but anyway, we learned from it. And what we found was that people actually would administer shock, and they were more likely to go even to the full extent. And the full extent was actually labeled with 3x's, and that's 450 volts. And they were likely to actually go to triple X if the person giving the order, so the equivalent of the experimenter administrator of the study, stood closer to them. So I'm missing out pieces on this, but your text has it, and I also have the link posted for the crash course in psychology, where he does a great job of explaining both this study and ASHES. Now, let's continue with Milgram again. So when Milgram asked 110 people how far they would go, it's like me saying to you, okay, 266, how far would you go? Most people thought that they would disobey by about 130 volts, keeping in mind that the range was from 14 volts to 450, and this moved up in 15 points increments. So, of course, self-serving bias is a thing, which we would have covered 2 chapters ago. And no one is likely to admit that they will be cruel and administer high voltages. But even when these same individuals were asked how high they thought another human would go, none of the 110 participants thought another human would actually go to the full voltage. In reality, 65% of the participants, that's 26 of 40 humans, actually went to the extent of voltage to hurt the innocent learner who simply got their memorized word pairs wrong. Ladies, I don't want you to smirk and think that because the original study only had men, that this was a man thing, because it was replicated and some small changes were made. The experimenter may have, in one version of the study, may have noted that the learner had a heart condition, and then they even included women, and what they found were women, same rates of men, were likely to obey. It should be noted, though, that almost all of them hesitated, and that's why they needed the prompts from the experimenter. And they did show visible signs of discomfort. So, sweating, kind of looking nervous, that kind of thing that you do when you're doing something wrong or something feels wrong. But even though they were visibly nervous and, they may have hesitated, they still administered the shocks. So before we leave the slide, though, I want you to read on the 4 features that increased compliance. That's in your text. It's here. So the slippery slope, framing of shock, opportunity, and limited time. So go over those in your text as well, because those are important. So now the ethics of this. In a nutshell, it was bad. If this is 2019, 2020, 2021, there's no way that this would have passed. If it was 2010, it still was not going to pass. But just to clarify things, the learner did not get a shock, although the teacher, the person who was participating, thought that he was. And the potential psychological trauma for someone who went all the way to ch06 because the experimenter told them so was so while the person was screaming could negatively impact someone in ways that extended beyond the end of the experiment. So luckily, a year later, the 40 participants were interviewed and they found that the psychological impact was, even though it was present, it was short-lived and it was not significant. So even for those who went all the way to ch06 because they felt pressured by the authority figure to do so, they may have been bothered afterwards, but it did not stick. All right, so we found that humans are also more likely to obey when the experimenter was present. There's a clause, though, the experimenter has to be deemed a true authority. This may be the difference between you following crazy orders from a police officer who's in uniform, so Royal Bahamas Police Force officer, as compared to if a top flight security who's at your local grocery store asks you to do something crazy. You'd be like, no, for the person who you may have less respect for. And so similar to that experience, or similar to that, is same with the institution. The participants noted that they responded the way they did because of the institution that the experimenter represented. It was Yale. That is, one of the I'd say top 10 institutions. Ivy League, carries a lot of authority, a lot of weight. And so if somebody from one of those places telling me to do something, well, they are a doctor, they must be smart, they must know what they're doing, this must be okay. And that's pretty much how we would actually rationalize that experience. Okay, now I want to highlight here the relationship between behavior and attitudes. As we have learned already, our attitudes are limited in predicting behaviors, right? Social settings just tend to play a far more stronger determinant. Power of the situation. Social norms are powerful. We've already explored this, but as your text has an entire section on it, we will review again in this context now, compliance and obedience. What Myers and Twenge also highlighted that is interesting for discussion is the development of new norms and how small incremental actions lead us to evil that was nowhere near our original intent. It's just crazy. Okay, and here is a summary of those classic obedience studies. I would suggest that you take note, make sure that you're familiar with them, and are able to discuss and talk about it. All right, so that is it. We'll see you again in part 2 of chapter 6. Okay, so now we're here. What breeds obedience? The beauty of Milgram's experiments is that we didn't only learn what people would obey to crazy extents, but he also was able to understand why. So when the learner was not seen, people acted with the greatest obedience. When the learner did not make noises, all the teachers obeyed calmly through the end. So when we can't see the person who we're punishing or abusing, then it's fine. This makes sense. Let's think about this and apply this to social media and how it's so easy to be bullies now because no one could see who you are. You can't really see those people. It's you could say whatever you want to say and just keep it moving. And what they also found was when the learners were in the same room, only 40% of them obeyed to the full throttle. Another version of the study had the teacher actually had to come in contact with the learner by forcing them to put their hand on what was supposed to be a live wired shock plate. Crazy, right? So you, as the participant, you sign up for the study, person gets it wrong, and then you have to physically get up, walk over, and put their hand on a shock plate. Believe it or not, yes, there was a dip, but there still was 30% of the persons who participated who were willing to do that, to put somebody in potentially physical pain just to be obedient to what the experiment was asking of them. And although this was a different and unpublished study, Milgram also looked at the relationships between a learner and teacher. If you think that humans are a lost cause and we should, just pretty much throw the whole planet away, well, not quite yet. Only 15% of the participants were willing to administer shock if the learner was a friend, a relative, or someone they knew. So what does that say? Well, we would risk disobedience to authority if we actually have a connection with the person.